Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Lost Decades podcast. This episode, we will be talking about the 1980s to the 1960s BC.
Good
So that
year.
means we'll hear about the Beatles.
Yeah. The BC Beatles, the
Yeah, the
Scarabs.
Scarabs. That's the ancient Egyptian version of the Beatles. Um, all right, I'm Austin.
I'm Andrew.
And I wanted to start off the episode just with some quick notes and maybe mild corrections, but definitely not as many corrections as the last episode, which is always a good sign. So, there were a couple things that have happened since 2000 BC that we haven't really mentioned, so I just wanted to throw those in there before we get too far away from the turn of the millennium. So, around 2000 BC, there were farmers and herders that traveled from modern Ethiopia and settled into Kenya. So Kenya was first getting, I guess, settled. The ancestors of the Latins arrived in Italy. There were the first Minoan palaces on Crete. So I had mentioned Minoans last time, and I said it was like some sort of palatial period, but right around 2000, they're building the first palaces, which essentially means it's a sign that there is like a hierarchy in the society and there are richer people that have palaces built and rulers. And the Bronze Age begins in North Ancient China. Stonehenge is largely completed. It says here horses were tamed and used for transport. I don't know the exact years on that, but sometime around 2000. And the last woolly mammoth goes extinct on
Yep,
Rank.
I heard about that in some island off of Siberia.
That's cool. Yeah. So there's pharaohs. Well, there's also woolly mammoths. And then, yeah, that's really all I have for that. Did you have any corrections?
Not for Egypt. I do have
Not
some
for
when we
Egypt.
get to Mesopotamia.
Sounds good. So, just to catch everyone up, last episode we had talked about how in 1995, Pharaoh Mentuhotep II dies, and that ends the 11th dynasty. So then the 12th
The
dynasty
third
starts with
or the
Am
fourth, right?
Amenemhat. Might be the fourth. Either
It
way,
is the
I'm
fourth.
Mentuhotep. Yeah, I think you're
I
right.
said that not confidently, but I know it's the fourth.
No, you're right. You're right. So anyway, we're still the 12th dynasty is actually quite long. It goes from 1991, the year I was born, all the way until 1782. It looks like here we've got the 12th dynasty. Amenemhat actually rules all the way from 1991 until 1962. So we're essentially just continuing the second half of his reign this episode. And do you want to say anything about Amenemhat?
Amenemhat. I finally know how to say the name correct.
That's good, because I do
Um,
too.
I listened to a lot of pronunciations to make sure I got it right this time. Um, More just that I thought was interesting. He was a commoner, which was a bigger deal because the
Hmm.
fact that he came from a commoner family all the way up to vizier and then eventually, obviously, to pharaoh kind of shows that he clearly was very good at what he did because, like most through history, for a commoner to rise up, even not to king status, but just to vizier, obviously shows an immense level of competence and like skill and knowledge. So it's interesting that he was able to pull that off. And it also helps explain why when he took over, obviously when there's dynastic changes, there's always issues with nobility and stuff like that. But for him, he was particularly plagued by that. It's the reason he made that other city that was south of Memphis, purely because he was just having way too much pushback from the nobility and stuff like that. And he was obviously just like Mentuhotep. He was very brutal in his crackdowns and everything like that, and then also very rewarding of the people who stood by him. So, yeah.
Sounds like a pharaoh. Yeah, no, and the fact that he ruled for so long is also, I mean, you can't
This,
be too bad if you ruled for that long.
and his two reigns, it's nice we split it up this way too, because his first part of his reign was pretty much consolidating power, building the new city, making people the cult of the, developing the cult of the king, bringing back that worship of him as a god, really solidified. And then the second half of his reign was a lot of conquests in Lower Nubia, which is ironically Upper Nubia, because again, the river flowed from south to north. So at the time, they saw that as Lower Nubia.
And in case you don't have a good grasp of geography, because it took me a long time to really wrap my head around how this works, even though it sounds simple, but basically, imagine southern Egypt is more highland, has more mountains and higher area. So then when it's raining, the rain gathers and then it slowly eventually becomes big enough to be a river that's flowing down, 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 and it keeps going down through Egypt and it empties out into the Mediterranean. So that might be sort of basic, but I feel like it might be helpful for some people.
Well, and speaking of that too, because it kind of comes up, I was reading about the cataracts of the Nile
Hmm.
River. That was a lot of things they used to describe the different regions. And I guess those are, actually, that's what those are right there that you're
Yeah,
looking
the numbers.
they're essentially just whitewater rapids, lower levels with a lot of like lower levels of water with a lot of rocks and rapids, and were very easy kind of break points. I think even in modern day, there's a lot of dams in those regions. Um, so that's kind of how they split up their empire because again, the Egyptian empire wasn't really spread that wide. It was kind of thinly along
Mhm.
the Nile, and then however far they could project their power.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I also wanted to show how far away Ijtawi is from Thebes, and also kind of it helps you see how upper, which again is the southern part, Egypt is so different from the northern part. Like they're fairly far away from each other, and then it doesn't seem like there's a ton in between. I'm not really sure why this map seems like there really is nothing in between there, but it does show how it was a pretty important moment because it'd almost be like moving the capital of the US to California or like Kansas or
Yeah.
something. It's pretty that'll have an impact. Um, so yeah, Eminem Hat is ruling, and like we said last time, he wants to build pyramids like they did during the Old Kingdom, and they had stopped doing it for essentially because they had been more fractured as a kingdom. There, no one had had enough power to build the pyramids like they used to. So he wanted to show that they were back, and that's why it's called the Middle Kingdom because it's essentially um, a renaissance of the original version of the Egyptian kingdom. And one thing I wanted to add was that he begins the unusual practice of co-regency. So he crowns his son, Senusret, as co-ruler while he's still alive, which essentially no one had ever done before.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of people, we obviously don't know about the fall of Mentuhotep the Fourth, but a lot of like scholars and stuff that I read believe there's no concrete evidence again that his desire to do that probably obviously it was for stability, but probably because he saw how unstable the succession was from Mentuhotep the Fourth, and it allowed him to gain so much power, and he was kind of essentially pulling the ladder up behind him to make sure no one else did the same thing to his future heirs.
Totally. And I had looked it up because I was curious if this had happened before, or if not happened before, but if it happened again. And not too often, but it is a thing where so Augustus had chosen his stepson Tiberius and granted him equal powers 2 years before his own death. And so that's literally 2,000 years later in 13 AD. And then it happens another time in Rome a couple centuries later. Charlemagne crowns his son Louis the Pious as co-emperor. Again, for a similar reason, probably that he just wants to make it clear and not have chaos after he dies.
And that's
You'd
the
think
first
more people would do it.
random fun fact. That's the first Louis that all the other Louis in France derive their name from.
Oh, interesting. And yeah, there's a lot of Louis. There's at least like
Yeah.
14, right? Yeah. And anyway, yeah, King Henry II in England also does the same thing. And apparently, the Byzantines made it standard practice. So most Byzantine emperors would crown their successor while they were still ruling. And
It's a good idea.
that was a stable empire. I'm just
Yeah.
saying.
I mean, it shows that they cared about succession because it's funny how a lot of rulers don't really care or consider succession until they're literally on their deathbed. I heard a common thing in general that I'm sure throughout history that rulers are a little bit afraid of their successor, pushing them off and just taking over immediately. So they tend to be scared to let something like that happen.
But it's a good thing that in our modern era, we don't have old people like holding on for dear life to their
Oh
power
yeah, I
and
can
not letting
imagine.
go to the younger generation.
That would be
That's
crazy.
totally done now.
Yeah, we fixed it.
So you can probably tell us more about what happens in 1962 BC, that is.
Oh, true. But before we get to that, I wanted to get to kind of the couple of things he did before that that were important. He
All
had
right,
a
go
lot
for it.
of campaigns in Nubia, and a lot of that region had traditionally been under the control of Egypt in the Old Kingdom, but due to the intermittent period, there was not a lot of the Nubia and other nearby states felt they could push into that region. And so he ended up setting up forts right around the first cataract and using that as kind of a launching point to go after the Nubians. And I mentioned last time the Nubians were fashioning themselves kind of as pharaohs. They said one of the things that they believe probably pissed off Amenemhat was that some of the Nubian kings were calling themselves the son of Ra. And obviously, there can only be one son of Ra. They were calling themselves pharaohs and sons of Ra, and he was not happy about that. And so, between the first and second cataract is where apparently a lot of the gold mines for that region are from, and a lot of wealth for Egypt. So he pushed in and took over a lot of that region. Granted, for a while, it was more just stopping raiders and stuff like that, not really part of the empire yet. And that gets to the 1962 thing because Amenemhat, was assassinated.
Actually,
And
real quick,
one of the
before we get to the
reasons,
assassination, I just want before we moved on, I wanted to say, first of all, it looks like there is like a big lake here, so I can see why this area would be important, right between the first and second cataract.
yep. And again, a lot of the gold, which was a mainstay for their, you know, obviously income, but even sources of power and stuff, building thrones and building, relics, holy relics of gold and stuff like that to help solidify their power. And that's the only reason I brought up the assassination is one of the reasons they believe people felt emboldened to take the king out was his son, and again co-monarch, was campaigning in that region, trying to conquer that region permanently for Egypt. And so he was away and unable
That's
to
and he was gone.
defend.
Okay, I did read that he wasn't there.
Yeah. And so he was assassinated. Funny enough, we don't know much about it because a lot of the things we know were written much farther after, and again, are heavily, most likely, propagandized. I mean, probably one of the things you saw was the instructions for Amenhotep's son. It's
Yeah.
written in an interesting way where it's written from a first person perspective of him basically recanting his like death and how he was assassinated. It's very
Whoa, like beyond the
like
grave.
yeah, it was very
That's
interesting
cool.
that he kind of sat there and was like, "Yes, I was just, wistfully daydreaming about the futures of Egypt, laying in my bed when I heard a commotion and like a viper, I remember that part. He said, I stood up ready to strike, but it was too late, and my son was away campaigning, and nobody can fight alone, and the guards killed me." And funny enough, this came obviously much later, so not only is it propagandized, it potentially could have been used by his successor to get rid of people in the government that he did not like by sort of blaming them, saying, "Oh, well, he talked to me and
He trusted his people too much.
he said who killed him." He, to be fair, it doesn't say by name, but he mentions guards and specific, and maybe even a priest. So it's possible that they were doing that too.
And it was a long dynasty, so it could have been much later. Yeah, his ancestors are looking back to the founder of their dynasty. He's like the Alfred the Great for, or the Charlemagne for this dynasty.
Hmm.
Can't you just imagine that movie? And wouldn't it, why don't we have a movie like that where it's set in ancient Egypt, and it's about the pharaoh getting assassinated while his son is like at a war. Wouldn't that
Yeah,
be so cool?
it would be. I think what's funny is, and it actually lends better to a movie, is we don't have a lot of information about not just only the
Right.
assassination, but the reign of his successor as much. And so you could kind of go in and just sort of, I don't know, make your own
Make
history.
it up. Yeah.
You can't go too crazy, but like with a lot of historical dramas, we don't know how certain people died or what specific people took what actions. So we can kind of
Yeah.
estimate, throw in some artistic flair. So
Yeah, and it's obviously you got to be careful, and you're just going to go in not expecting a history lesson, but it's kind of perfect because it gives you the outline of the events, and you just have to fill in the gaps and sort of decide like what were people's motivations and things like that.
yeah.
But it's just such a cool setting, especially it's that era where they're like, okay, we're building pyramids again, and we're trying to be great again, and then he gets assassinated by who knows.
Hmm.
So we will find out more about his son Senusret next episode because he takes over in 1961. Um, yeah, so before we moved in fully to Mesopotamia, I wanted to kind of review a couple of the major civilizations in that area at this time. So I'm going to start out with the Elamites. And one thing to know about a lot of these guys is they're basically known by the city that is their capital main city. So like the Elamites, actually the Elamites might be the one exception, but
No, well, they're from Elam.
no, they are from Elam, right? It's the Amorites. I don't think there's an Amor, but like the Assyrians are from Assur and the Babylonians are from Babylon.
And I have in my notes from before, I looked up the Amorite means literally like people of the West, if I remember correctly.
Okay. That's something good to remember though, is the Amorites are to the west and the Elamites are to the east of the
Yes.
two
I mean,
rivers.
the Amorites first, and that's another kind of fun fact, they're in the Bible several times.
That's
They control what is modern day Israel and Palestine.
oh, wow. Okay. Canaan.
They were it's actually what's they're mentioned by that name, but they're also referred mostly as the Canaanites in that region. And so
Actually, I
they
should have pulled up this map sooner, but
Yeah, and so that is the region they control, and they end up moving east and east, taking Upper Mesopotamia, Lower Mesopotamia, not really as one kind of conglomerate thing. That's another thing to not get confused by is a lot of these are independent tribes kind of doing their own thing. They're just sort of grouped together, similar to how the Romans called, the Germanic tribes, not even just barbarians, but just Germanic tribes. They're not like one unified force known as Germany. They're just a bunch of
right.
independent tribes doing their own
Vaguely
thing.
connected. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was thinking about that too, where we see something like what happens where the third dynasty of Ur collapses, and then it essentially gets taken over by the Elamites, and it would be like, the Italians taking over for Paris or something. Like they're all Europeans, but if you're living there, it's going to be a different language, different culture.
And it's
And
funny, the Amorites did blend in pretty quickly, though.
right, they did. They did. Because
And so,
they really are so close to it. They're not that, I mean, at the time you have to walk everywhere, but still, they're all pretty close.
and another fun fact, they don't know this for sure, but a lot of people think, in the Bible, Abraham was probably among some of the Amorites that migrated into Israel at a later time period.
Wow. That is
Yeah.
fascinating. I'm
So,
actually really excited to get more into things from the Bible because
yeah,
we're not even, yeah, we're just in Abraham, which is
they
essentially
really think the
in the Bible.
Israelites were just kind of a subgroup of the Amorites and part specifically the Canaanites, and kind of
Mhm.
just developed their own thing, their own religion and stuff, and moved into that region. And so I think it's really interesting to see the beginnings of that because funny enough, they still don't think Abraham was until like 1750 BCE.
I know. That's one other thing is I had read, did you say the Amorites meant like people from the West or something? Or
Yes.
okay, I had seen something, and maybe this isn't true, but either way, it leads to something interesting. But I'd read something about them being named after like tw tent dwellers, like they lived in tents.
Well, they were
And so,
semi-pastoralists, so they were almost
right.
kind of like the Mongols and stuff, minus the horses. They moved around with their herds, staying in specific areas. That's why they're semi-pastoralists. They're not moving around constantly. They kind of follow the
Loop
herd
around when they
at
need
different
to.
times of year. Yeah.
Yeah. Which seems like a nice life, honestly. But yeah, it just made me think that it's around this general time period we're talking about, the 2000s, that a lot of these people are starting to stay more and more in one place. And I see things about how, like in Assyria, it's around this time that they have the first temple that they build in Assur, and they, maybe that's part of the reason they settle down is they're making these shrines to the gods, and so people are coming to the same place over and over to worship the gods, and then it starts building up around it. I'm just sort
Well,
of
and that's
making
what's
it up.
interesting. The city of Nippur was pretty much their holy site. That's where they thought the gods sat. They actually
Mm,
had statues of the gods, which again, I was trying to do research into, did they think the statues were the gods or not? And it's sort of a mixture of both.
mm,
It's like they thought the statues was essentially where the gods would reside on Earth. They were simultaneously in
mm,
heaven doing their thing, but they presented themselves in the statues. And so, funny enough, the statues were actually had like their mouths cleaned, their teeth brushed, and they had clothes put on and
mm.
taken off by the priests and stuff like that. And they would also be put around on like in parades and stuff, or going down rivers on boats, almost as if they were physically
Wow.
alive, going around and just seeing people would see them. Um, and it was just kind of an interesting concept, I thought.
No, that reminds me, actually, I read this book that I think it's called Magic. It definitely has magic in the title. And I will say it's a little bit misleading because I thought it was going to be a lot more about straight up magic, which it's really more about really old ancient humans, I think Neolithic or maybe even earlier, and how they used magic, which was essentially, yeah, these different ceremonies. But one thing I remembered from that was these really ancient people seem to kind of think of not just animals, but statues and like big rocks and natural features and trees and things like that as like almost essentially the same thing as a human. Like they had less of a division between human and animal. Probably no offense because partially they are just more like an animal at the time.
Yeah.
But you can kind of see that's cool to think about that even now in Egypt, it almost feels like that's a leftover from really ancient humans and sort of thinking of rocks as being alive or whatever.
Yeah.
But also I wanted to talk about how, yeah, the a lot of the rulers got their power technically from a god. It wasn't just that they're in charge, but just like a lot of kings, these rulers essentially said, you know, this god, whatever it might be for our city, if it's Acer or Ra or something, you're like, okay, they're in charge. I'm just the earthly mouthpiece, like puppet for
Yeah, that
them.
was interesting to read. I didn't realize, but yeah, the Babylonian kings fashioned themselves not in the same design as the pharaohs in terms of, um, how they dressed and acted,
Right.
more in the sense that they saw themselves as divine, and there were cults of religion around their life, and they were, yeah, the mouthpiece of the god. And so that's why a lot of them, even into the Babylonian time, go to Nippur to sort of get crowned and show their respect to the gods, to get respect from these people. So even though there's all these different cultures and stuff, they all sort of integrated and saw that city as an important, you know foundation to set up the reign. Um, so before we get into the Kings, I had a couple corrections because it's a couple small things, but yeah, the one thing we kind of did talk about, the Amorites did not, because I mentioned how they came into the region and kind of settled. They didn't really take over. There was more like constant fighting in different areas. So sometimes a city or two would get ruled by a warlord or something that was an Amorite, but many of the other cities were also independent and ruled by Akkadians or Sumerians and stuff like that. And also because we're going to talk about the successor to Ishbiera. I originally said that Ishbiera kind of took over after Ibbi-Sin had, been killed or had been destroyed, but he actually had taken over like 10 years prior to that. in
Okay.
not of the whole kingdom, but of
Of the
Ishin and a
city.
few of the cities around him. He essentially declared his independence and said, I'm doing my own thing. And then as Ur get weaker and weaker and pretty much only had the city of Ur left, then it was destroyed. And then later, Ishbanera kind of came in and reconquered those lands. And we talked about the lamenting of the fall of Ur and stuff and fashioned themselves. I just wanted to kind of correct that it wasn't like a he was loyal until the end and then took over. He was kind of doing his own thing.
The whole time. I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's what I noticed was that's what happened was that Ibisen lost power, and not only did it cause Ur to collapse, but yeah, it essentially caused these other cities to grow bigger, and there wasn't really one that was clearly more powerful than the rest. They were all fighting to be the best. But one thing I read about the Amorites was that so later, so they found Isin and Larsa. That's why it's called the Isin-Larsa period. They have the two cities. Later on, they're going to found Babylon, and they're going to have the old Babylonian Empire.
Well, and to make a small correction, they're not really founding it per se. They're just coming in and taking over those cities and ruling as the new dynasties. These
Oh,
cities
okay.
had existed. They just,
Right.
yeah,
So
that
they came from originally some city and started spreading out into the general area.
again, they came from Palestine and Israel, that
Oh,
region.
right, right, right. But apparently later on, for the 14th dynasty, so this isn't going to be for a couple hundred years, they actually found the 14th dynasty, which is going to be, I think, after the second intermediate period.
Yeah.
So look forward to that.
Yeah, they're an interesting people. So then right now the key thing is in the Isin-Larsa period is Ishin is the strong one at first. And so focusing on them, we're into Shu Ilishu, and he is the second king of Isin. He took over after Ishbi era,
Okay.
and he is known for essentially he didn't really do a whole lot other than try to stabilize the region and expand it to recapture a lot of the old Ur 3 dynasty and essentially fashion themselves as, the successors that they were Sumerian. And I just thought it was interesting that they weren't Sumerian themselves. In fact, most of the people, including themselves, spoke Akkadian, but to kind of keep that up, almost like with the rulers in Europe speaking Latin, they would still speak Sumerian and stuff and issue edicts and proclamations in Sumerian, but they
Interesting.
themselves and the people around them all spoke Akkadian.
So Akkadian almost feels like the English or something of the period where it was the more common tongue for a lot of
Yeah,
people in the
it
area.
was.
Okay.
So, one of the big things he did was, and that's why I wanted to mention the gods, is when the Amorites came in and destroyed Ur, they took away their essentially patron deity, who was not Nana, I guess would be the right way to say it,
Hmm.
god of the moon, and they had taken it and were essentially holding it hostage. But Shu Ilishu came in, and we don't know exactly how, if it was through force, diplomacy, negotiation, what, but he was able to get that patron deity back and bring it back to Ur and essentially reestablished it and said, like, oh, we're back, like I've done this. Because that's one of the interesting things is they all of the kings, the Sumerian kings, did this thing called year names, where every year they gave themselves like a new name and title that essentially just explained what they were doing.
It's very
And
convenient
so
for historians.
yeah, it helps because I mean that's how I'm reading a lot about them. I have both of them here for both the kings. They're different year names, and yeah, his second year is when he was able to get Nana back and erect it.
So sorry, what year is that actually in our Gregorian calendar?
In our Gregorian calendar, it would have been 1983
Okay, cool.
BC, but I guess that's obvious at this point.
Right.
Um, yeah, he elevated his daughter to become priestess at Nippur, like high priestess, to be in charge of that, again solidifying their power. Um, Something I thought was interesting too with their religion, they build thrones specifically for their gods to inhabit. And I'm not even saying they put the statue on it because the statue would be in a temple. They would essentially just build thrones and giant throne rooms where no one would sit because it was implied that the god was sitting there. That was his throne. So that's another thing they did in several of his names is building thrones and different palaces specifically for these deities. Um, hell, he even built a boat for one of them, Ninurta, which is it was interesting too. I was looking up what the boats looked like at the time. Um, I wish I had it saved, but they're mostly just reed boats.
So we're jumping ahead now, but what happens in 1960? Basically, the Elamites attack Ur, they loot the ziggurat of Ur, and they drag Ibisin to Elam as a prisoner,
And they kill him.
and they kill him. So
We
that,
don't know for sure, but it's
yeah,
just that was common practice at the time. There's no record of him after this, so it's assumed he was killed.
yeah, it's I think you can make a pretty good guess there. So would you consider that moment when the Elamites fully like sack Ur, they literally kidnap the guy and kill him? Is that considered the very end of Ur 3?
That's considered the end. Now, granted, we can, as we've talked, you can kind of see the writing on the wall as these different governors are declaring themselves kings and not paying patronage to Ur, and they kind of shrank and shrank until Ur pretty much only controlled the city and some of the areas around it, and Elam just kind of came in and took them. Again, the Amorites were a big part of that. Not that they were actively attacking these cities or anything, but by disrupting trade routes, being in the region, having their own farms and their own things, it really made it difficult to have a cohesive empire that was all working together.
All right. Well, was there anything else, any fun facts to share about the, what are we calling it? Since it's the still the
Isin-Larsa period.
Isin-Larsa period.
And we're
So the
still on Ishin,
Isin-Larsa
but I
dynasty.
did want to say, because we're still in this time period, 1975 is when Idin Dagan takes over as the third king of the dynasty of Ishin. And he, funny enough, was able to make peace with the Amorites because he married off his daughter to one of their princes, who would have, and she would eventually be queen of that region. He, again, was more about stability, building palaces and stuff, and he expanded the realm a little bit, but more to just conclusively taking over the borders of the old Earthry dynasty, pretty much encompassing that. Not much expansion beyond that for now. And then one of the weird things, and I don't know if maybe I should talk about this or not. I don't know what we're doing for this podcast, but he had he's most known for there was a whole ceremony written down where they're reenacting the marriage between two gods, and he played one of the gods, and the high not the high priestess, that was his daughter, a different priestess would play one of the female gods, and they literally would reenact the wedding but then actually have sex on stage in front of everyone.
Nice.
So
We need
I
to bring
thought
that back. That would be cool. It kind of is coming back. There are places like
that
New York where it's essentially like, I mean, I guess it's sort of like going to like a strip show, but it just feels more, it's like they're combining art with,
But
because
yeah, I wanted to mention Indagon because he rules most of this time period all the way through 1954, which we'll discuss next time. But he was, yeah, important. And another important thing is they did not title themselves King of Ur yet. So they weren't ready to take on that full mantle. They just called them Kings of Ishin, Kings of lands of Sumer and Akkad.
you got to remember, yeah, that's the key of this time period is that there really isn't a major empire. They're all these regional people that, ebb and flow. But yeah, there's a lot to talk about because there's so many little civilizations. Like before we wrapped it up, I wanted to make sure I didn't forget to mention the Assyrians are also around right now, and they're gonna become bigger quite a bit later. But I thought it was cool that in 2025, so a year after we technically started this podcast, he is the king of Asser, and he's essentially the founder of that city, is the best way to
It's
put it.
that during the Ur dynasty is when Assur and Babylon are both
Hmm.
two of the major players there.
Yeah. That is weird. And they're both just little cities, but they're getting started. But I guess that kind of makes sense. It's like, okay, the big guy falls, so now the littler guys can slowly start
Yep,
becoming.
and they learn from them, like we talked before. They learn from the good and the bad of those previous empires and build upon them.
Yeah, and then one last thing about the Assyrians was that they also spoke Akkadian, and apparently they were really more of an oligarchy more than a monarchy, so ruled by more than one person, by a small group. So essentially, the way it worked was that the authority was split between three centers of power. So there's an assembly of elders, so essentially like a senate. Then there was the hereditary ruler. So the ruler presides over the assembly and carries out decisions. So basically the executive branch. And he wasn't referred to as king. It was instead, like I said before, was the title of the city's patron deity. Asher was their main god, and the ruler was the essentially the high priest for Asher. And so he was like steward of Asher. And then the third leader, I guess, was called the eponym because he is the one who gives the year his name, which is apparently something they also do later on in like ancient or classical Greece, which has a funny title. It's called the eponymous archon, but that's literally how they told like said the years in Greece, and same with the Roman consuls. They That's how they called the years, was by whoever was consul that year. But anyway, this eponym in Assyria was elected every year by lot, which I think means by voting,
Yeah.
not just like random chance. And he was responsible for economic administration, and he could detain people and confiscate property. So he was kind of like the financial guy and the head of the
Security or something.
police.
Yeah.
So it's just funny that even 4,000 years ago, they understand how to divide power in a way that makes sense. And yeah, I think it's a good sign to wrap it up because I'm losing my voice here.
No, it's good. I mean, we try to keep it more concise because again, the rest of the
Yeah,
world, there's things going on, but we don't have much historical evidence of specifically what's happening. It's a lot of broad over these centuries, these things happen where Egypt, Mesopotamia have a lot more. This year, this happened. This year, this happened. It was a lot
exactly.
easier to kind of understand the history of it.
I
So,
think this would actually be a good episode to jump in on for someone that is just finding it. I think it'd be kind of a good first episode. We're just focusing on Egypt and Mesopotamia. And I think we're going to just stick with that for honestly at least 5 or 10 episodes.
yeah. Until the other regions, because we are keeping track of them. We're reading about them every episode. I read about what's going on in these other regions, but I'm waiting until there's some major kings or events or something that we can talk to.
We've got our eyes on it. No, same with me.
Yeah.
I know around when we need to start looking into other areas, but next episode we'll stick with our 2 decade system and we'll go from 1960 to 1940. So that means we'll talk about World War II
Yeah. I'm
and
excited.
Elvis. All right, that joke will never get old. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Lost Decades Pod. Leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Leave us any questions you want us to answer. We'll do a mailbag sometime. And we need to have a sign off. Like, how do we end the episode? Like
I don't
something
know.
about like, oh,
I'll
I
come
got
up
one. All
with
right, ready?
something.
All right. Talk to you next time. Get lost.
Get